Oh no, don't worry, I'll count you in. Sorry, I'm clicking just to make sure that the audio levels are fine. So that's all perfect. Yep. Okay, so you're going to start in 15 seconds. Ten, 5, 4.
As a student at an all-boys, fee-paying high school, I'm often hearing about how stupid Jacinda and the Labour Party are for their taxes and rules surrounding the environment, namely the recent ute tax. As a 15-year-old, I don't really have an opinion on this tax. I've decided to take a deeper look into different professional opinions on this tax and whether I think it is a good idea or not. Introduced in July of 2021, Labour's ute tax, or car discount, adds an additional cost to the purchase of utes or other high-emission vehicles.
I'm very happy with
Buyers
that.
of these vehicles are charged certain amounts of money based
Yes.
on how many
Oh,
carbon
they can come up in a
emissions
few
their vehicles
minutes.
produce.
If it's not playing down there,
In
can you send someone
Southland,
up?
from April 1st to July 1st, the number of petrol cars registered was only 429, less than half of last year's 861. This would lead me to believe that the ute tax is achieving its goal effectively. Whether or not it is achieving it in a fair way is a different question.
National MP Simeon Brown argues that the ute tax is unfair.
It's so unfair because you end up taking from people who don't have a choice. You tax people who have to buy utes for work, like farmers and tradies, and you effectively just dish that money out to people who can already afford to buy a Tesla. Even with the subsidy, a Tesla costs $70,000. Not many people can afford to buy a Tesla unless you've already got a lot of money. And so this government's effectively subsidising wealthy New Zealanders to buy cars they can already afford by taxing people who don't have a choice about what vehicles they have to drive for their work.
David Newton, head of the physics department at Christ's College, disagreed with this, stating that an incentive is needed if we really want to make a change.
Well, unfortunately, we do need to have a real incentive to walk away from anything burning fossil fuels. And if the incentive is, the only incentive that really works is in the back pocket. And so I'm a great believer in incentivising people to make the right choice.
Simeon Brown agrees that electric cars and reducing carbon emissions should be promoted in New Zealand. It's just the ute tax is the wrong way to go about it. He does have some different ideas, though.
And the real issue is actually facing people trying to buy EVs is supply. There's not enough being built. And also there is a real issue around the electric vehicle charging network in New Zealand, and that's where the investment really should be going. New Zealand's a very small market, so we can't fix these problems overnight, such as the supply of electric vehicles. We don't manufacture them here in New Zealand. But what we can do is invest in what those challenges are, such as the EV network and other things, and that's what we need to be prioritising.
The issue of practicality is also still a part of this conversation, with many people arguing that they need to own their own utes for driving up to the ski fields or towing a trailer. David Newton has different ideas.
Towing a trailer, towing a caravan will continue to be problematic with electric cars. However, that's what people hire vehicles to do. So I think that people are going to have to get used to hiring vehicles when they need to have something to tow. And just towing around a trailer for the sake of it, as many tradesmen do, is just not going to be tenable unless they want to pay the extra for their use.
David Newton agrees that the tax is proving effective and that many brands have started to reduce their eco-footprints.
So LDV have brought in fully electric vans and a fully electric ute. Rivian are continuing to promise their ute. Even Toyota are promising a ute in the 2-year time frame. The bigger manufacturers have been caught on the hop by Tesla, and they are struggling to catch up because they thought they had until 2030 to do the changeover for their factories from internal combustion to electric. So they've been caught on the hop.
The ute tax caused quite a stir among the farming community and triggered the hell of a protest campaign, a series of peaceful protests organised by Groundswell, where farmers would drive their trucks and tractors into the city with various different signs on the back of their vehicles. These signs mainly displayed writing against Jacinda Ardern and the ute tax, but an image surfaced of a pickup truck with a sign saying, "We live in New Zealand, not Aotearoa. Stop ramming Māori language down our throat." This image blew up online and sparked a lot of hate towards the hell of a protest movement, with people questioning if these protests were anti-ute tax or anti-Māori. Judith Collins, leader of the National Party at the time, said the signs like those were completely out of place and that we don't like that kind of thing. She did, however, state that that's why we need there to be debates about things so that people can understand what's going on. Having done all my research and talked to David Newton and Simeon Brown, I feel as I am in favour of the ute tax. I think Simeon Brown made a very valid point about how improving the EV network and the supply of electric cars in New Zealand would possibly make a greater change. I think this goal may be unobtainable at the moment, but that in a few years' time it could be a better option. David Newton, in my opinion, is correct in saying that incentive is necessary if we want to make a change, and clearly this incentive is working, with the number of high-emission vehicles registered in Southland halving. Overall, this tax may be a bit of a pain for some people, and may mean that their first ute requires a bit more work to buy, but as David Newton told me,
we just don't have a choice anymore. There is no choice about getting rid of fossil fuels for your generation, the younger generation. You are going to see large rises in the velocity of wind. You're going to see sea level rise in your future caused by fossil fuel burning. And even though New Zealand is a small player, we are still able to drive innovation .
Good afternoon, I'm Luke Hearn and welcome to the Newsroom. Climate change is a problem affecting the world today. New Zealand will face problems such as extreme weather patterns and snow lines rising up to 200 metres. Warmer winters will leave alpine environments faced with shrinking glaciers and expanded predator habitats. Because of New Zealand's environment and geographical location, tropical storms will reach New Zealand and sea levels will rise. Mr. David Newton, an environmentalist from Christ College, gave an insight on what these weather patterns may be and how sea levels will affect New Zealand.
What people have got to understand is that with climate change, the storms have a lot more energy and a low pressure system is even lower and the sea is warmer, so the air above it carries more water. And so you get a phenomenon called tidal surge, where the sea actually, because there's low pressure above it, actually rises above where it would normally be and flows in like a tidal wave over over what would have been the beach. You get coastal inundation in a major low-pressure zone, which is what we've seen in America with the big hurricanes. Coupled to that, we've got the weather systems, with a warmer ocean. Even in the last 5 years, we've seen weather systems which would have died coming down through the Tasman Sea because the Tasman Sea has been cold. That sucks all the energy out of the storm systems and they peter out. But last year we saw a major tropical cyclone which managed to get almost halfway down through the Tasman and barreled a river of rain on the Tasman district, and huge flooding, hills fell, slips in Nelson, and they're talking about red zoning housing, major catastrophe for the people who own those properties. And this type of event, large tropical storms getting further south, is part of, unfortunately, our future if we do not control climate change. In New Zealand, we're going to see, of course, we're surrounded by the sea, and if the ice packs on land currently melt and at an increasing rate, we're already seeing the Tibetan ice fields almost disappeared. They reckon they'll last for another 40 years. So if that ice melts and goes into the sea level itself will rise around the world. There's enough ice in those 4 places to raise sea levels by 20 metres. Now, in our lifetimes, my lifetime, 25 years, we might see quarter to half a metre of sea level rise, but in the lifetimes of students at the school, 50, 70 years, then we might see a metre.
Not only are New Zealand's coasts going to be affected by climate change, but its alpine environment will too take a hit. This starts with rising snow lines and shrinking glaciers, creating increased predator habitats and less chance of settled snow at lower elevations. NIWA researcher John O'Conway speaks on how New Zealand's alpine environment will be affected by climate change.
For what we expect now at a certain altitude, we drive up to a base of a ski field or whatever, at that same elevation, maybe a month less in terms of the snow on the ground. If we think about the sort of the elevation that we would get 3 months of continuous snow on the ground, we're expecting by mid-century, so that's 30 years away, under a sort of worst case scenario, that's going to rise by 200 metres. So going up 200 metres higher by that mid-century if things follow sort of a worst case scenario. So that's shorter snow season and it's moving further up the mountain in terms of that settled snow. And that's the kind of numbers that we're sort of looking at for New Zealand. I mean, I think probably more significant for the alpine environment will be what happens to our glaciers. So glaciers have a memory. They remember how much snow there was and how much melt there was over decades, and they are shrinking really quickly, and they'll continue to shrink. And once some of them will disappear, and once they're gone, they're really hard to grow back. So I think that's going to be a massive impact on the alpine environment, certainly around the central southern Alps where there's a lot of glaciers, and that's a big feature of it. We're also going to see a lot of pressure on alpine flora and fauna as predators are able to move further up the mountains. The range that they'll be able to exist in will get smaller and smaller. Mountains get smaller as they go up; they don't get bigger. So, their range in terms of where they can forage for food and breed and all that will get smaller, and that'll put a lot of pressure on our alpine species. And also having less snow and earlier disappearance of snow cover will mean stream temperatures are going to increase in the future. And that's going to put pressure on our in-stream biota fish, invertebrates, some of those of our native species that live in those headwater streams. So that's going to put pressure on them. So I think we will see it's going to have a large impact. Certainly in another 30 years, things will look quite different. And by the end of the century, it's will be even more significant.
New Zealanders will also see problems due to climate change. Sea level rise and the greater frequency of big tropical storms will create problems for the houses and insurance tied to these buildings. David Newton talks about the danger areas and why these are of concern.
So sea level rise around the coast of New Zealand, there's a map developed by the government, and what that means is that the land near the sea is vulnerable, and being vulnerable, the insurance companies may choose to either raise their premiums or simply not insure. So insurance is a big thing. The lack of it is even bigger if you want to sell your property. There'll be properties around who won't get insurance, and if you don't get insurance, you can't raise a mortgage. And if you can't raise a mortgage on the property you're trying to sell, it means the only people who can buy your property are going to be fully cashed up. So that's a major risk for some people's families because so much wealth is tied up in their batch.
Because the amount of carbon humans are putting into the atmosphere increases each day, New Zealand is already starting to see these effects. Despite efforts from around the world to cut down on these carbon emissions, without change, this future will become reality.
Good afternoon. I'm Jacob Jarks, and this is the Newsroom. New Zealand has suffered a 400% increase in smash and grabs over the last 5 years. This increase can only be seen in New Zealand compared to countries such as Australia and Canada. Businesses nationwide have had to react promptly to protect their companies and staff. Michael Hill Jeweller is the biggest jewellery chain in New Zealand. The company has over 40 stores nationwide, and they have been hit incredibly hard by smash and grabs. The company has had to insert fog cannons and security guards in most stores. Andrew Lowe, the CFO of Michael Hill, has given his insight into smash and grabs.
I think there's a few reasons why the smash and grabs have increased. We're not seeing the same level of activity in our other stores in Canada or in Australia. So I think there are probably some issues more broadly in New Zealand, sort of around community and society, perhaps unemployment and schooling. And if this is just seen by the criminals, who are typically quite young, as an easy way of getting access to property and value and cash.
Even though smash and grabs have increased, there seems to be less activity at night. All stores in New Zealand have made the effort to make sure that smash and grabs are reduced at night. Some of the bigger stores have inserted fog cannons, while some of the smaller stores have made sure their glass is very strong and very hard to break into. We have also seen that in jewellery stores, they lock away all of the jewellery at night, so it cannot be accessed even if the criminals do break in.
So at night time, we've taken measures to strengthen the doors, and we have fog cannons installed. So as soon as someone enters a store and that motion is detected, the fog cannon would activate. It pumps out very dense smoke, and it makes it impossible to see what you're doing or any further activity. What we also do is every night, we pack away all of the product, all of the jewellery in the store. That's packed away into secure safes.
Since store owners have put procedures on trying to stop smash and grabs at night, the criminals are starting to do it in broad daylight. They do not seem scared of the public seeing their faces, neither are they scared of it getting filmed. Stores all across New Zealand are also going to have to think on how they can prevent robberies and smash and grabs in the daytime.
In the daytime, it's obviously more challenging. You've got customers and members of the public in shopping centres. What we have done, though, is we have the same fault cannons, and they can now be activated during the day. So it's either by the staff with a pendant around their neck, so any member of the team could activate it if they saw trouble coming, or a switch in the back office. And we've also put security guards in every store, and they are present for the full shift during the day.
Store businesses are in real trouble and they may need help from the police and government. Andrew states that the police have started an operation called Operation Rhino. This operation is solely focusing on helping small businesses and big businesses and helping prevent smash and grabs in every single store across New Zealand.
The police have been very active. They've actually formed a task force. It's called Operation Rhino, and that is focused solely on addressing jewellery robberies. Now, not all robberies are Michael Hill stores, but many of them are. We have probably more jewellery stores in New Zealand than any other brand. We've got 48 stores nationwide. So the police have been very active in educating retailers like Michael Hill and other retailers. They've visited stores, they hold meetings with landlords, they come to us to access our camera footage. So we have cameras installed in all of our stores, and they capture very good footage of events, or often people who might scope out our store and then commit an offence in another store or are seen going by. So the police have been very active, and obviously they're working hard to arrest the criminals after these events to ensure that they don't offend again as well. So they've put a lot of resources into this and a lot of time to, try and get best practice out into as many stores as they can. From a government point of view, they have been funding some of the security arrangements, but that's mainly for the smaller stores, the smaller operations.
The consequences for these criminals can be high or low, depending on your age. If you are under the age of 18, the consequence doesn't seem to be bad. There is no jail time, and it's probably just home detention. If you're over 18, the sentence seems to start at 8 years, and it can go up or down depending on if you've done any crimes in the past. Store owners think that there should be a higher penalty for people under the age of 18. It seems like they are just let out after doing such a horrible crime.
The police do share final outcomes with us about each case in terms of what's happened. How the criminals are treated does in part depend on their age. So if you are 18 or over and you're part of the adult criminal system, the starting sentence for what's called an aggravated robbery. So if you go into a store armed with something, a hammer, a weapon, that's aggravated robbery. The sentence for that starts at 8 years. Now, it could be more depending on how many crimes you've committed. It could be less if it was your first offence or your age. So that's quite a severe penalty for adults. For juveniles, there are consequences. It does depend, though, again, how often the individual's offended or what sort of crime was committed. So it is taken quite seriously, but there's lesser sentences for younger people.
I am now joined by Travis Dixon, a psychology teacher at Christ College. There is a part in your brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is what tells you if you should do something or not. Like, say for instance, should I go yell at that person on the street and say something embarrassing? Your brain would stop you. This is what the prefrontal cortex does. Majority of criminals are under the age of 18. The prefrontal cortex takes 25 years to fully develop. This could be one of the main factors why kids are smash and grabbing, because they don't think about the consequences and what can happen if they get caught.
Your prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that allows you to think through the consequences of your actions. Okay, so you see a pretty girl walking down the street, you think, oh my gosh, she's really pretty. Suddenly, like, some idea pops into your brain, I want to yell something out, but it's your prefrontal cortex that goes, hang on, don't do that, that's silly, that'll be embarrassing, and you can see what might happen, right? If you're around a group of friends, there's a bit of peer pressure, you might want to, they might be encouraging you to do something, and then you have this instinct to do it, and then you go, no, because I'll get grounded, I'll get gated, I'll get in trouble, I'll get a detention. That's your prefrontal cortex. All right, so that part of your brain doesn't fully stop developing till you're about 25. This is why young people are most at risk for committing these impulsive crimes that are possibly just done, with just peer pressure and getting together going, this would be a great idea, let's do a smash and grab, we'll make some money, and the prefrontal cortex isn't yet fully developed to say, hang on, that's not a good idea.
Police are doing investigations into why smash and grabs are occurring so frequently in New Zealand. They have investigated and discovered that TikTok is one of the main reasons for people to commit these horrible crimes. These criminals want to show off to their friends and show the gang members who can do a bigger break-in. They also want likes and followers. This gives a huge dopamine hit in your brain, which makes them want to do it more and more just to gain attention.
There's a chemical in your brain called dopamine. Right, and dopamine is something that gets released. It's a pleasure chemical, right? And it actually gets released when we're anticipating something awesome happening. And social media taps into your dopamine, right? And so that's why people get addicted to social media, because dopamine is the chemical regulating addiction. So it's not just about smashing and grabbing and making the money, right? It's actually about smashing, the grabbing, filming it, posting it. Now, this might also spiral and actually sort of feed off one another, because what you'll then see once you post on TikTok, you'll have other people watching it, and you'll have other young people watching it and wanting to imitate it. And this is something we call in psychology social learning, right? Or observational learning. Like, we learn how to do things by watching other people.
As we know, New Zealand has a huge problem with smash and grabs, and we need to find a way to solve it. Some people may think that a juvenile detention centre is perfect for the kids that get captured, but it may not be. If kids don't really think about the consequences and they go to a juvenile detention centre, do you think it'll actually make it better? These kids have already got a hard enough background, so just putting them in a harder one will not solve anything in New Zealand.
Yeah. Increasingly, I'm becoming more dubious about our ability to solve these societal problems using governmental structures. I think they lack the personal social touch that I think might be required. And so I would be interested to see any solutions that require charitable individuals who want to help these boys that are committing these crimes. On the one hand, you might look at it and go, yes, higher consequences would be a good thing because it would be more of a deterrent. The problem with that logic is if you don't have the prefrontal cortex capacity to think through the consequences, then the higher deterrent, the higher penalty doesn't matter. Because you're not thinking about the consequences anyway. So you're not thinking about, oh, there's a big consequence for this action, so I won't do it. Is one argument. Now, the other argument as well is that what would that higher consequence look like? Does this mean going to a juvenile detention centre, basically a prison for young kids? So we come back to that. If we know that we can have a hunch that these kids, these boys, had pretty bad childhoods, they have a lot of trauma in their childhood, is going to a juvenile detention centre going to just add to that trauma? Are we saying that these boys have had trauma and they have abnormalities in their brain, or they've got different structures in their brains, right, that are the reason why they cause these bad crimes? Does it help to solve the problem by then going to put them in environments that are actually going to make their brain development worse?
New Zealand is trying their best to help stop smash and grabs across the country. Since stores such as Michael Hill has inserted fog cannons and security guards, the rate of smash and grabs has dropped. Hopefully, the government can help stop smash and grabs and help the criminals who need a better purpose in life.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Angus Hoare, and this is the Newsroom. Now more than ever, electric cars are becoming a part of our world in travel and everyday life, but we need to ask the big questions about them. Now I have Mr. David Newton speaking. David is a physics teacher at Christ College and is very knowledgeable on this subject. What are your thoughts on if mining up lithium is more or less effective than just driving your normal petrol car?
In terms of the chemistry, lithium is essential at the moment for a brand new type of battery called a lithium iron phosphate battery. It has the highest energy density of any chemistry of battery, and to make little machines fly or move, you need a very efficient, both in physical size but also weight, that occupies a small space with as much energy packed into it as you possibly can. And lithium iron phosphate batteries do it best.
Lithium is sort of a rare resource, would you say? And then what happens when the lithium ion batteries cannot be used anymore? So what happens when they just be shut down or whatnot? So what happens in a couple years, 10 years maybe, when we're getting low on lithium? What happens then? Do we go back to petrol cars?
So, in answer to your question, what happens next? The lithium metal there is no lithium metal actually in the batteries. It's the electrolyte between copper and aluminium layers in the battery for most of them. Both of those materials are really valuable, and consequently when the individual battery cells are degraded so that they don't do their job for an electric car, which requires several hundred amps at very high voltage to make them work, they are retired and used for permanent storage for solar cells. So first of all, they'll be repurposed from cars and stood beside buildings, and this is already happening in the United States, where big solar farms have repurposed batteries from cars which store the electricity produced by solar cells during the day to give them out during the night. And then once they don't last forever, the next use will be for scrap value. Because they're full of copper and aluminium as well as lithium, then they will be recycled, but the recycling factory at the moment are located overseas. But as we know from every other type of recycling in New Zealand is very good at cleaning up waste metal, and because it's valuable, it will happen automatically. You will not be dumping thousands of dollars worth of copper and aluminium in the local tip.
And now we have John from Avon City Ford speaking. Why do you think people are still buying petrol and diesel cars?
Look, Angus, essentially because there's no choice. Electric's very expensive for most people. Petrol and diesel are still the best option for economy, and petrol and diesel still can do things that electric can't, things like towing. Okay, so, New Zealanders like to tow things like boats, caravans, horse floats, the like. The other thing is that I probably should mention is in cold weather, electric cars lose a lot of their range very quickly because batteries don't like the cold, and when you're cold you have heaters and things running, and they pretty much halve their range in a cold period. So there's a lot of technology that needs to be developed before we probably have the confidence to run with electric.
And do you think petrol and diesel engines in cars will still be important in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. They're not able to replace what they do with electric at this stage. I suspect when they can do it, they'll be very expensive still. So it'll still be cheaper to run them. Life-wise, your petrol and diesel will last a lot longer because batteries have a limited life. And I think what you'll see is if they force people into electric, you'll actually find people hanging on to their petrol and diesel cars just a lot longer. The fleet will age a lot, but they'll need them for specific uses like that. Because battery cars, they don't like cold weather, they don't like hills, and they don't like loads. It all shortens the range. So there's a number of things that affect what you do with a vehicle.